Johnston.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I also rise to address the Fiscal Integrity and Transparency Amendment Bill. Madam Speaker, this bill is yet another example of the CLP removing transparency from their decision-making and with it opportunities for the public to hold the government to account for their decisions. Madam Speaker, the purpose of Parliament is to be accountable to the people, and as the Treasurer has said, the NT was always going to go over our borrowing limit, meaning the only effect this amendment will have is to remove the requirement for the Treasurer to produce a report addressing why more money was borrowed. It's not too much to ask that the Treasurer explain why money is borrowed. This is particularly true when we're speaking about a jurisdiction with complex and unique funding needs, and it's particularly true when we already suffer from a lack of accountability about how funds intended for one purpose are used for another. Despite the championing of large private industry that goes on in this chamber, the mining and gas industries are not the backbone of the NT economy, the public and the community sector is. The public and the community sector is the largest contributor to the NT economy, to jobs, to growth and to the gross state product. The NT economy is public, and that has always been the case, and that it's not going to change regardless of what members in this chamber might like to believe. In the NT, managing the economy, the service it funds and the social needs it meets managing public money. Our economy is not separate from our society. We can't manage the economy's needs without managing our society's needs. Madam Speaker, we often talk about the economy as if it's a separate entity devoid of any relationship to the health of our society, but the opposite is true. A helpful way to think about the economy as a measure of the health of our society. All the decisions that governments make affect the economy. They affect what services get money, which corporations mine our land, which groups of people get support, and who's left behind. All of these decisions bear a cost, and all of these decisions contribute to whether a government is or isn't responsibly managing the economy. To manage the economy responsibly, we first must govern responsibly. Madam Speaker, I was motivated to run for politics in the Northern Territory and speak up for my electorate of Johnston because when I look around this place, I can see that wealth in the Northern Territory is not being shared. I see some people getting very rich, benefiting greatly from the opportunities available. When I drive to work through Fanny Bay and Bayview, past many beautiful houses and large swimming pools and boats, I can see that some Territorians are doing very well here and that economic growth is making some Territorians very wealthy and very comfortable. But I know that that is only happening for some Territorians. From the work that I've been doing in communities over the past 30 years, I've seen and I've experienced firsthand that many Territorians are not getting wealthier. They are not benefiting from the Northern Territory's economic development story. To the contrary, many Territorians are becoming poorer. There may be wealth created in some places in the Northern Territory, but the story on the ground, and especially in remote communities, is that many people are not receiving any share of that new wealth. This is not just my observations, but it's a story I hear from so many people who I speak to in my electorate. We've all been watching as the gap between rich and poor in the Territory grows wider. The recent 2021 National Census showed us that Indigenous policy in the Northern Territory is getting worse fast. Between 2016 and 2021, there was a 10 to 13% increase in Indigenous poverty rates in most places around the Northern Territory. In other words, an average First Nations person living in Katherine or Borroloola or Tennant Creek or Yuendamu or Wadeye had 10% less money to spend in real terms in 2021 compared to what they had in 2016. Territorians in our regional and remote areas are growing poorer, not richer. We all intuitively know this. If you lived in Darwin for a long time, like I have, then you know and feel that many people are growing poorer, that disadvantaged Territorians are going through hard times and receiving less support than they used to. I want to draw the attention of the Chamber to the actual source of the Northern Territory Government's revenue, why the government gets that money and what we should be doing about it. In short, all of us today and all of those working in government offices in Darwin have generous GST distributions from Canberra to thank for our generous salaries and comfortable Territory lifestyles. These generous GST distributions are given to the Northern Territory in recognition of the high need in the Northern Territory. That is, that we experience unique remoteness and disadvantage of the Territory compared to other parts of Australia. The key takeaway, Madam Speaker, here is that because of the disadvantage and remoteness of the Northern Territory's population, the Northern Territory government receives very high federal funding levels from Canberra. But the reality on the ground is that much of the money the Northern Territory receives from Canberra never reaches the Territorians most in need, the Territorians that it was intended to reach. Madam Speaker, this is the major reason that I raise concerns about the NT debt ceiling and reporting requirements being lifted. Successive governments have been mismanaging money in the Northern Territory and we're paying for it in social costs. If social needs like safe and secure housing, access to healthcare go unaddressed, they get worse for the people going without and they get more costly for the society as a whole. To manage the economy responsibly, I say again, we must govern responsibly. We need more transparency and accountability regarding how this money is spent before we should allow the government to borrow more. I want to be clear that some debt is fine, some debt is good. Borrowing now to make our future better is a good idea, just like a person borrowing money now to own a house outright later is a good idea. But there are two parts to this question. If you borrow now and mismanage that money, you don't get the benefits of your borrowing later and you still get saddled with the debt. Madam Speaker, it's important to know that there is a reason we had the debt cap and associated reporting requirements put in the first place. The NT's debt to gross state produce ratio is the highest in the country by a long way. And despite what the members of this chamber will tell you, we're not going to get out of this hole by boosting our gross state product with fanciful private development. We'll get out of this hole by managing our money better. Managing our money better means funding the services we need now so we don't pay the cost of unaddressed need later on. Many of us might not realise that the generous GST distributions the NT receives are the result of Canberra's approach to addressing disadvantages in the NT. The very high GST distributions we receive are intended to ensure that we have the same opportunity as other states and territories around Australia to provide our residents with comparable services. For example, the GST distributions are designed to balance out geographic and demographic disadvantages that individual states have and ensure that all states and territories can afford to provide a decent standard of service and care. This process is called the horizontal fiscal equalisation, and it's a method to balance out inequalities between states and territories through differentiated GST distributions. So, recognising the unique challenges of the NT, our government receives 5 times as much funding through the GST per person compared to all the other states and territories. The Northern Territory government receives well over half its funding from the Commonwealth government through GST distributions and grants. This is money the federal government in Canberra is providing to the Northern Territory government to provide services and infrastructure. According to the NT government budget papers from the 24-25 financial year, the NT government has an annual revenue of $8.7 billion. This is the annual budget of the NT government to spend on all services. And of that $8.7 billion, almost half, or $4.2 billion, comes from GST distributions. So this means, obviously, that half of all services provided by the government is funded thanks to those GST distributions. I note for my fellow members that all of this information is publicly available in the NT budget papers from the Commonwealth Grants Commission submissions to the 2023 Senate inquiry into the extent and nature of poverty in Australia and the 2023 Closing the Gap review, CAP review, and from the Commonwealth Government resources about GST distribution. And it's been a deep dive for me learning about this because it's a new area for me, but I wanted to try and get my head around it. So I'm saying again that the Northern Territory receives a lot of money from Canberra because of the very high need of remote Territorians, and yet much of that money never reaches those Territorians. Instead, much of it stays here in Darwin, in our pockets and on our streets. Remote Territorians continue to become poorer, and meanwhile economic development in the NT appears to be benefiting those of us here in the city. A friend who'd never been to Darwin before came to visit me this week, and this inequality was stark to her and confronting from the first glance. It doesn't make much to understand that inequality in the NT needs addressing urgently, and it cannot be addressed without needs-based GST funding going to the people that it is intended to help. We should not be borrowing more money before we can confidently say we're spending the money as it was intended to be spent and addressing the inequality it was intended to address. We can't confidently say we're justified in borrowing more money if we don't know if we do not know what we're borrowing or why. And that's what this amendment really is about. It's about letting the government borrow more money before it's been held accountable for the money intended for remote Territorians that it's spent in other places. How the budget is spent and why must be transparent. When our economy is dependent on public funding and services, we cannot fix the economy without transparency in government. Madam Speaker, I'll say again, for the benefit of the Chamber, that the public and community sector is the largest contributor to the NT economy, to jobs, to growth and to gross state product. We're not going to fix inequality by approving more mines. We'll make it worse. We're not going to fix inequality by fracking Beetaloo Basin and greenlighting Middle Arm. And we won't fix inequality with the Territory Coordinator. Major private development plays a minuscule role in the NT economy. As we heard yesterday from the Treasurer, fracking in the Beetaloo Basin is only projected to raise $8 million in revenue a year. $8 million may sound like a lot, but when it comes to the scale of the Territory budget, it's not even enough to run Royal Darwin Hospital for a single day. The annual budget for the Territory is over $8 billion, not $8 million. The NT economy is dependent on public funds and public sector jobs. Major private investment has never played a major role in the NT economy and the standard of living for most Territorians, and it never will. By continuing to insist on big business development and on oil and gas, the government is gambling with taxpayer money. Instead of making responsible choices, ensuring money intended to help vulnerable people in our society gets to them, they are repeatedly taking unfounded risks. It's not the job of the private sector to regulate the economy or the budget, it's the job of the government. Our economy does not need wishful thinking, it needs integrity and accountability. Governing responsibly means making decisions that are responsible to look after our long-term future and avoid further and endemic social costs. We need fiscal integrity measures like this debt cap, Madam Speaker, because it's overwhelmingly clear that the government is managing taxpayer money without integrity. You do not have to take my word for it, Madam Speaker. You can listen to the ministers when they say, I stand proudly with the Ministers' Council and we are sending a signal that the Territory is open for business, and drill, baby, drill. I just want to note that that's about the 5th time I've heard Trump quoted and cheered in this chamber, and it makes me ashamed.
Make the Territory great.
Democracy. Make Palmerston great again.
Managing the NT budget and the NT economy is not an easy task. It requires intelligence, it requires integrity, it requires planning, and it requires transparency. Removing reporting requirements for borrowing beyond a $15 billion debt cap without any plans in place to address how we got there in the first place is not responsible government. Removing reporting requirements for borrowing while we have the most stark inequality in the country with no plans to address the misappropriation of public funds designed to mitigate the inequality is not responsible government. Madam Speaker, it's also important to me when I speak in this chamber to provide an alternative way forward. What I hope for is for us to find a pathway to better include and empower regional and remote leaders to have a say in how money is spent in the Northern Territory. Not all decisions about how money is spent in Darwin should be made by our largely homogenous government bureaucrats. Instead, we need to find better ways to share power. To address worsening poverty in our regions and remote areas, we need to get better at listening to the voices outside of Darwin. I've had the privilege of working with many people and communities in my career in the Northern Territory, and what I've learnt is that people often know what they need and they know what will work in their area and in their neighbourhood to make things better. I've often been surprised at how creative and how successful they are and how bold they can be in coming up with solutions. It's true that we face many challenges in the Northern Territory, but something I've learnt from my journey to becoming the member for Johnston is that local communities are powerful when they come together and their messages can be heard and understood loud and clear. My vision for the Northern Territory is that we can find a way to bring communities together and give effect to the messages that they give us. As a member of the Northern Territory Parliament, I take the responsibility to listen to Territory communities and to do everything I can to ensure that money is spent in the way our communities are asking us to spend it. This is how we can make sure that the Territory's economic opportunities can be shared by all Territorians. Madam Speaker, there is a lot of work to do to make the Territory a more equitable place to live, and that work starts with more transparency, not less. We must move forward, Madam Speaker, not backwards. Thank you.